You are standing on the last beach of a continent, and the water in front of you does not end. It just goes, grey and patient, all the way out to a horizon you cannot see across. No boats out there, no lights, no radio, just open water, one unbroken line from here to nowhere. Now imagine that something is waiting on the other side of that water. You have never seen it. Nobody you know has ever been there. No map, no compass, no good reason to believe it exists. And you build a boat anyway. You take fire, too. A stone axe with a ground edge, a grindstone for seeds, and a handful of red ochre, because people who travel that far do not travel light. The boat is made of lashed wood and patience, and the crew is whoever was brave enough to look at the horizon and say, "Fine, let us go see." That sentence, spoken by somebody on a beach tens of thousands of years ago, is the real subject of this video. Quick warning before we go any further. This is not a story about boats being invented. Boats were old by then. Logs, rafts, canoes, some version of floating, had been carrying people across rivers and lakes for tens of thousands of years before the Wallace Line. What changed at that beach was the scale of the water and the willingness to trust the crossing. Distance changes things. It changes what you pack, what you pray for, and what you teach your kids. Here is the story you were told in school. The tidy version: humans walked out of Africa, walked across the Middle East, walked into Europe, and kept walking until they had covered the planet. All legs, all land. One very long hike. It is the kind of story that fits on a poster, and it is missing the single most important step in the whole journey, because the first truly ocean-going voyage in human history did not head toward Europe at all. And it did not happen late. It happened early. It happened across open water. And the destination was Australia. By the end of this video, you'll never look at a ferry ticket the same way again. That is a promise. 3 artifacts, not the ones you expect. A fish bone from a cave floor in the tropics, a stone axe from a rock shelter in northern Australia, and a drift of red ochre over a man who died 42,000 years ago. Follow those 3 objects through this video, and they'll take you to the moment humans stopped being land animals. That moment changed everything after it. Let me start by dismantling the poster version, gently. Humans did not conquer the world by walking. They conquered it by refusing to stay put, and water was never the obstacle the school books make it sound like. Rivers? Sure, they crossed those on logs. Lakes? Fine. But the trip to Australia was different, and the geography explains why. So let's look at a map for a second. Somewhere between Southeast Asia and Australia sits a line that biology textbooks call the Wallace Line. A real boundary, not a political one. West of the line, Asian animals, tigers, monkeys, elephants. East of it, Australian animals, marsupials, egg-laying mammals. Things that look like the planet tried again and got weirder. The line exists because of water. Even during the ice ages, when so much seawater froze into glaciers that sea level dropped by 100 meters or more, the water between the island chains and Australia never fully disappeared. At its narrowest, you were still looking at around 90 kilometers of open ocean. No land bridge, no stepping stones, no walking on the bottom. The current runs sideways. The nearest speck of land is out of sight, past the horizon. What do you even build a boat from? Bamboo, lashed logs, woven reeds. A raft with a leaf for a sail. Maybe, whatever it was, it had to carry people, fire, stone tools, and enough trust to survive a crossing with no rescue plan and no second chances. That is not a commute, that is a bet. 90 kilometers doesn't sound like much until you put it in perspective. It is wider than the English Channel at its narrowest point. It is open water, with currents, weather, and no coast in sight for the middle stretch of the trip. You cannot see the far shore when you launch. You have to trust the math of the stars, the direction of the wind, and the knowledge that land tends to exist, where birds fly at dusk. And people did it. People did it as a planned voyage with supplies, with axes to build shelters on arrival, with fire to cook the first meal, and with ochre, which we'll get to because ochre turns out to be the most telling cargo of all. So when did humans actually get there? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting because the date kept moving backward as the evidence improved. For a long time, the textbooks said the first Australians arrived maybe 45,000 years ago. Then the dates pushed further back. A rock shelter called Majedbe in Arnhem Land in Australia, North, was re-excavated by a team led by Chris Clarkson and published in Nature in 2017. And the site produced something that made archaeologists very uncomfortable. Ground-edge stone axes, grindstones, and ochre sitting in layers dated to around 65,000 years ago. 65,000. That is tens of thousands of years before the accepted dates for modern humans walking into Europe. And it is not a contested, slightly situation. Part of the archaeology community pushed back on the dating, arguing the numbers might be closer to 50,000, still enormous. But the honest answer is that the exact number is still being argued about. And that argument is part of the story, not a footnote to it. Dates move. The story doesn't tap. Now here is the part that makes the whole crossing feel real, not like a line on a chart. Before the 2010s, an archaeologist named Sue O'Connor was digging in a limestone cave on the island of Timor, at a site called Jeremali, and her team reported something strange in the ancient refuse. Fish bones, not little shore fish, deep water fish from the tuna family, species that swim in open ocean far beyond the reef. The bones were dated to around 42,000 years ago, and they are the oldest known evidence of humans fishing deep ocean waters anywhere in the world. Read that claim carefully, because it is quietly explosive. To catch tuna in the open sea, you need a boat that can leave sight of land, a crew that can work together for hours or days, and a plan to come back. You don't drift into that kind of fishing by accident. You build toward it. That idea, that you can build toward the far side of the water, is exactly what separates an expedition from an accident. A drifting boat found land by luck once, and nobody could repeat it. A planned voyage could be repeated, improved, and taught. The difference is invisible in the bones and obvious in the results. The crossing happened more than once. Australia got settled, not just visited. Somebody taught somebody the way, and here is the beautiful part about the timing. Timor is not Australia, but it is on the route. You can stand on the shore of Timor and understand the whole project. People who were already fishing the deep sea, already building ocean-going boats, already carrying stone tools and grinding stones, were one more crossing away from a continent no one had ever seen. That is not a migration, that is an expedition. And the people who made that final crossing stepped off the boat into a world that ran on a completely different set of rules. Let's talk about the world they landed in, because this is where the video usually forgets to look. Australia at that time was a continent of giants, and I don't mean that as a metaphor. There was a wombat the size of a small car, Diprotodon, weighing in at around 3 tons, grazing in landscapes no wombat you've seen could survive in. There was a flightless bird called Genyornis that stood about 2 meters tall, with legs built like pillars and a beak that could have taken your hand off if you were foolish enough to get close. There were short-faced kangaroos, Procoptodon, bigger than today's red kangaroos, built for speed and violence, rather than hopping politely across a field. The list goes on. There was a marsupial lion, Thylacoleo, with claws like scythes, and there was Megalania, a monitor lizard longer than a crocodile, hunting in the open scrub, the kind of creature that makes you grateful for the invention of distance. Now picture landing on a beach with nothing but stone axes and fire in a world where every direction pointed at an animal that could kill you. That is the actual survival challenge this video is about, not the crossing. The morning after the crossing. How many people does it take to land on a continent like that? not a lone hero with a spear. That is for sure. A small band maybe with children and elders, because a group that can reproduce doesn't survive the first generation. You need people who can hunt, people who can repair a boat, people who remember the stories, and at least one person who refuses to panic. Split that load across a crew of 20, and suddenly the giants have a problem. They re-big, they re-dangerous, but they have never met a thing that plans. So how did they do it? This is where the evidence gets quieter and more intimate, and it centers on a place called Lake Mungo, in the dry country of western New South Wales. Lake Mungo today is a lunette, a crescent-shaped ridge of sand dunes, and the wind has been carving into it for thousands of years, exposing layer after layer of old shorelines. In 1974, a geomorphologist named Jim Bowler was walking along one of those eroding dune faces, looking at ancient sand layers, when he found human bones. Not a burial that had been dug out and scattered, a deliberate one. A man, later known as Mungo Man, lying on his back in the sand with his hands folded across his chest and his whole body dusted in powdered red ochre. The ochre had been applied with care in a ritual that took time and intention. Radiocarbon and other dating methods put his death at around 42,000 years ago, give or take, and Bowler's team published the full analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2003. Let me pause on that single image. A man 42,000 years ago, on a continent that had barely any humans on it, buried with his hands folded and his body painted in red. That is not survival behavior. That is grief behavior. That is a community stopping its day, gathering, and treating a dead person like a person. Ritual burial of that kind is older than anything we loosely call civilization, older than farming, older than writing, older than the word for any of the things we think of as making us human. And it happened in Australia, out at the far end of the earth, at the end of the most dangerous voyage humans had ever taken. The people who crossed that water did not just survive the giants. They brought their whole inner world with them, and they buried it in the sand with their dead. Grief is not survival. Grief is what survival is for. So what was the actual survival software? Let's assemble it piece by piece, because it is more interesting than the usual answer, which is just they were tough. They were tough, sure, but they were also organized, and their toolkit included something that doesn't usually make the list of heroic ancient achievements: fire, used as a landscape scale tool. Aboriginal communities across Australia practiced what researchers call fire stick farming, carefully controlled burning of grassland and scrub, on purpose, to clear undergrowth, to encourage fresh growth that attracts game, and to open up sightlines so predators could hide. Fire in their hands was not just a campfire, it was a management tool for an entire country. They used it the way farmers use plows, and the landscapes they lived in were shaped by that use. That matters because it means they were not passive guests on a giant continent, huddling in caves and hoping not to get eaten. They were actively reshaping the world they had crossed an ocean to reach. The pulse of those fires would have been visible from the coast, a continent slowly being tended, and every one of those burns required knowledge passed down through generations. When to burn, where to burn, how big a fire to set, what to do when the wind turns. That is not instinct. That is an inherited science, and it is exactly the kind of thing that gets erased from history when we only celebrate spear wounds and big game skulls. Close your eyes and picture that burning landscape, because it is one of the oldest pictures of humans managing nature in existence. And it looks nothing like the caveman's story. Smoke on the horizon in a pattern, a strip of fresh green grass coming up behind the fire line, where game will gather in a few days. That is chaos. That is a schedule, a calendar written in smoke. The same skills that brought people across the ocean, reading signs and planning ahead, got turned right around and used on the land itself. The ochre tells the same story from the other direction. Red ochre appears at Madjedbi, deep in the oldest layers. It appears on Mungo Man's body. It appears across many of the earliest sites in Australia. Researchers generally read that as social glue, body paint, rock art, and ritual color that bound communities together, marked identity, and carried meaning across a wilderness. Think about that for a second. The people who crossed the Wallace Line were carrying paint. Paint, not extra food, not extra weapons, but color, enough of it to decorate their dead and their own skin. That is a society with a sense of itself, and it took that sense of itself across 90 kilometers of open water. Some researchers argue the pigment had practical uses too, and they were probably right. But the ritual reading is the one that won Tay, let me go. Honestly, stop and think about bringing paint on a voyage like that, because it is the weirdest cargo on the boat and the most revealing one, leaving the known world behind. And you pack color. What does that tell you? It tells you these people already knew who they were. They had names for themselves, stories, and a way of marking their own skin. The crossing did not invent them. They arrived already formed, already a we, and that we is what let them work together on a shore full of animals that had never seen a human identity as survival equipment. That is the quiet lesson of the ochre. Quick aside, because this is the part of the story that always makes me smile. Why do Australian animals look like they were drawn by someone who kept changing their mind? Kangaroos, platypuses, wombats, emus, a lizard the size of a truck, a marsupial that looked like a lion. The answer is isolation. Australia is a giant island, and once the sea levels rose after the ice ages, the crossing got harder, not easier. Animals that stayed there evolved on their own clock for tens of millions of years without placental predators pushing them into familiar shapes. So the continent didn't just host giant animals. It hosted animals that took evolution somewhere else entirely, and the humans who arrived early were the only ones who ever got to see the full lineup. Nobody since has seen it. We came too late, and the lineup was already gone. What happened to the giants is one of those honest science moments that a lot of popular videos skip, so I want to be straight with you about the uncertainty, because it is actually the most interesting part. The megafauna disappeared. All of it? Diprotodon, Genyornis, the short-faced kangaroos, the marsupial lion, the giant lizard, and the question of what killed them still splits researchers today. Some point to humans, using evidence like burned eggshells from Genyornis nests, studied by Gifford Miller's team, and published in Science in 1999, suggesting people were hunting or disturbing those birds. Others, like Van der Kaatar's team, published work in 2017 arguing for human-driven change on a larger scale. And a third camp, including Stephen Rowe, has argued that climate, not people, did most of the damage, with evidence published in 2013. The honest summary, the debate is still alive. The numbers keep shifting, and anyone who tells you the answer is settled is overselling you. What we can say is that the world the first Australians stepped into, full of 3-ton wombats, did not stay that world for long. Here is what the whole expedition reduces to. If you like numbers, a minimum crossing, 90 kilometers, a minimum crew, more than one boat, probably, a minimum toolkit, fire, axes, grindstones, and paint. Add it up, and the first Australians were not refugees fleeing a famine, not explorers funded by a king, and not soldiers under an order. They were volunteers. Every single one of them chose the boat. That is the part of the story that has never gotten the respect it deserves, because volunteers are the hardest thing in history to explain and the easiest thing to overlook. So let me come back to the beach, because that is where this whole story actually lives. When people talk about the great human expansion, they tend to frame it as a triumph of technology. Better tools, better weapons. But look at what was actually on the boats heading for Australia. Axes, grindstones, fire paint, and people who knew how to bury their dead. The technology that mattered was not sharper than what came before. The real breakthrough was psychological. Somebody had to look at a wall of open water with no land in sight and decide that the thing on the other side, whatever it was worth crossing for. That decision does not show up in the archaeological record. It is still the only artifact that explains every other artifact. The horizon was the map. Here is the small, strange thing about that. Every time you stand on a coast and look out at the water, you are doing the same thing they did. Maybe you are watching a ferry come in. Maybe you are on vacation, and the water is just scenery, but the apparatus is identical. Your eyes, a horizon, an unknown beyond it, and a choice about whether the unknown is a reason to turn around or a reason to launch. The crossing to Australia happened because somebody made that choice in the affirmative, and the entire human story after it, every island, every ocean, every continent that has a human footprint on it, is a footnote to that one yes on a beach. I used to think the impressive part of human history was the arrival, the moment feet first touched a new shore. Now, I think the impressive part is the launch, the hour before sunrise on a beach, when the crew pushes the boat into the water, and nobody knows if there is anything on the other side. That hour happened once, and then it became a habit that never stopped. Somewhere out there, past the end of every map you ever own, is the ghost of a beach where somebody made that call. The boat is gone. The axe is in a museum drawer. The horizon is still there, waiting for the next person brave enough to read it. See you on the other side.